Hello again, Ling 341. We've got a short lecture on stop acoustics today. So we're going to kind of transition from what we were talking about with fricatives and VOT to see how it works with stops in general. Not talking about the phonation type, but rather sort of cues to their place of articulation. So to get into that, we can think about what happens when we produce a stop. Excuse me. So if you think about producing a stop when you're in the middle of producing a vowel, so your vocal tract is open and then you go through a closing phase till you get to a closure phase, then poof, you pop it open with a release burst of some sort, and then you open the stop to the whatever the succeeding vowel might be. We don't in sort of articulatory descriptions often think that much about the fact that you have to go through closing and opening phases to get in and out of the stop closure. We've seen the ramifications of the stop release burst in the spectrograms before, but it turns out these first and last phases are actually kind of really crucial cues to figuring out what sort of stop we're producing when we look at it in its acoustic form. So what we see in terms of acoustic cues for the place of articulation of a stop is, number one, there's a formant, what we're going to call a formant transition out of the vowel. So by transition, I just mean there are going to be changes in the specific frequency values of the formants as we go into the stop closure. Then there's, during that closure phase, there may be voicing or there may be nothing at all. If you have a voiceless stop, there's just silence, so you can see that there is a stop happening in the spectrographic record, but you can't really tell anything more about the stop. If it is a voiced stop, you will see some voicing in there, maybe all the way through, and that's basically a cue for the phonation type of the stop and nothing else. After you release the stop, there's a brief release burst, maybe more than one. Those go by pretty quickly, and then you go into a formant transition into a vowel, so you see the formants changing their frequency values as you go out of the stop. And again, these transition cues turn out to be really kind of crucial. So let's focus before we get into that and on these release bursts. We've talked about these a little bit already. These are relatively easy to understand acoustically. The whole combination of cues is going to wind up being a little bit complicated, but if we walk through it step by step, it shouldn't be too hard. So with the stop release bursts, those the acoustic characteristics of the stop release burst tend to resemble those of a fricative made at the same place of articulation. So think back to what we learned about fricatives a couple of lectures ago. When we looked at sort of the spectral signature of bilabial fricatives or maybe labial dental fricatives as well, we found that they have a very diffuse spectrum. So there's sort of no one frequency region which is being emphasized or intensified more than any other, and we get energy sort of up and down the scale. The same thing is true of a labial release burst. There's no real filter in front of that burst. We can say a pa. So there's nothing to sort of amplify specific frequencies as opposed to others. I've got a sample here. I think this is me saying the word. Pot. I'm going to crank it up a little bit.
Pot.
Okay, so P-O-T, and so the initial stop here is the P, and this is the release burst for the P, and I think I've got just the burst here. Maybe you can hear it. No, I'm going to have to go outside of this. Yeah, so that little P is the P burst, and you can see it in the spectrogram. As I've labeled it here, it's just a single solitary vertical line, and there's maybe a little bit of more intensity here, but not really in any distinctive way. It just kind of goes up and down the scale, and usually the P bursts are not super strong. It's hard to kind of get a big forceful push of air out of your lips when you release them. Maybe because they're kind of spongy material. I'm not actually entirely sure why that's the case. You can contrast that either way, though, with the release burst we get for T. So alveolar release bursts will look a fair amount like the P release bursts, but they will tend to lack acoustic energy at the very bottom of the spectrum. And to some extent, we get higher frequency components becoming more intense as well, like you might expect for an S, but it's not nearly as clear as you'd get for like a sibilant fricative, where the high intensity or high frequency energy just really jumps out at you. So we can look at this in the same spectrogram, just look at the other side. So this is the T burst at the tail end.
Pot.
Here's the P. I'm I'll skip that for now. This is the T burst here at the tail end. So this is our P. One of the tricky things is the P burst tends to go all the way down to the bottom of the frequency scale, and with the T burst we tend to lack some energy here at the very bottom. And maybe there's a little more energy here for the T burst. We can listen to both of them, maybe. That's the T. That's the P. And you can do these yourself as well. Just make kind of not super loud ejectives, right? It's kind of easy to pick up that contrast. I'll play the K as well. We can listen to all three of them together. And the K burst is going to distinguish itself from the P and the T by being pretty intense, but generally speaking, at a very specific frequency. So velars are stronger release bursts in terms of overall amplitude, but that energy is mostly focused in the 1500 hertz to 2000 hertz range, sort of in between F2, F3, more or less. Another interesting fact about K release bursts is there can be more than one of them. We saw that a while back. We talked a little bit about the possibility that there's sort of passive K or velar trills sometimes when you release a velar stop. That just happens because it's hard to sort of move that the back of your tongue away from the soft palate. It's a sluggish articulator, so if you can't get it out of the way quickly enough, the airflow through the opening of the stop might sort of cause a Bernoulli effect that brings it back to another closure, and you get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 release bursts. This is me saying a different word.
Pock. Pock.
And I've got the K release burst here at the tail end of this thing. Here's another P burst. Got some aspiration. Here's my ah, a little bit of creaky voice. Then I've got the closure for the K, and what I see here is K release burst. Overall, it should look maybe a little bit darker than what we see for the P, maybe a little bit longer, and sort of a darker band of energy here in this 1500 to 2000 hertz range. Again, sort of at between F2 and F3 for Pock.
Pock. Pock.
And we can play all three of these by themselves. So let's do it again. K, T, P. Okay, it's pretty quiet, but these are not super strong cues to stops, place of articulation, or anything like that. But if you do sit somebody in a quiet sound booth and play just these release bursts to them by themselves, they can actually be quite accurate in identifying what stop that they came from. And I know that because that's actually the very first experiment I ran as a grad student way back when in the 90s, and people thought I was a little bit crazy, but it worked. So crazy like Fox, or a grad student, I suppose. Anyways, where you can't get a whole lot of information about place of articulation for stops is during that stop closure phase. So like I said earlier, normally if you see any sort of information in the spectrogram for these guys, you're only going to see low frequency voicing, like a very low first formant at the bottom of the frequency scale, and basically nothing else. So you can call that a voicing bar. You can think about why this might be the case. There's an analogy which is often given, which is like if you live in an apartment and somebody's playing like loud music in the apartment upstairs from you or something like that, you primarily hear like the bass notes out of that. You don't get a lot of the high frequency information. Kind of the closed vocal tract, your closed mouth, acts as a filter that just filters out the high frequency information and only lets the low frequency information through. So it's operating in a different kind of ways than we see an open tube filter when we produce vowels. It just lets the low frequency information go through. It's sort of like creating just a single formant, like right here. So this is me saying
Bug.
That's not me saying that. This is from an Armenian sample. Yep. So we'll play that again.
Bug.
And I went to Armenian here because this guy has nice, clearly, truly voiced stops, which I don't often get for myself when I produce English stops, because aspiration matters more to English stop phonation than voicing does. But in Armenian, we get the true voicing, and we can see it here in these voicing bars. So this is the ba, and you might also note, so this is a bit of a noisy recording. I've been meaning for a while to get a better one from Mouche, our Armenian Arabic professor, but don't tell him that yet. So this is just our B at the beginning here. It's voiced, and you don't see a really solid release burst here. Like I said, often bilabial release burst can be hard to spot or just not that strong to begin with. We do get more of a release burst for the G, and again, you can see a little bit more intensification of the overall energy here between F2 and F3. And then this is the voicing down here at the bottom. So here's our vowel, here's our two voice stops. And they look pretty similar on the spectrogram, maybe a little bit different, but I'll play them by themselves, maybe. Yeah, so I'll play both of these, and you can tell me if you can spot the difference. Yeah, that didn't work. I will reveal the answer, however, that the top murmur, this one, is the B, and this is the G. Yeah, so maybe you can spot that, but most people can't in any reliable fashion. So basically, all we can get out of this is the information that this is a voice stop. We can't really tell what kind of voice stop it is. So if we want to tell what kind of stop, which place of articulation it has, we're going to have to look at things like the release bursts and these formant transitions. But before we get to that, I'll show you sort of the contrast between a voice stop and a voiceless stop in Armenian. So this is
bag, bag.
And again, the voicing just stops here for the final stop for the voiceless version. And we still see the voicing go through all the way for the G as opposed to the K.
Bag, bag.
Right. And you also might notice that our release burst seems to be a little bit stronger here in the voiceless case. So there's more energy, especially at the high end here for the K release burst, and we get more intensification here in this sort of 1500, 2000 hertz region for the K. Okay, these are these are just little cues you need to kind of tune into if you want to be able to actually identify these things in a spectrogram. It gets easier the more practice you have. And then the other thing you really need to pay attention to are these formant transition cues. So so the resonant frequencies of the vocal tract are going to change as you go from making a vowel to a stop. I'm not going to go into the specific mechanics of how this works, but you can remember our basic principle that the formant frequencies you get for any particular vocal tract configuration just depend on the size and the shape of the vocal tract, the size and the shape of that open tube. As you are closing or opening that vocal tract to go from a stop to a vowel or vice versa, it's going to change those formant frequencies. And that change tends to happen a lot more quickly than sort of the steady state of the vowel. So you're going to have to kind of pay attention most particularly to the changes that happen right next to the stop closure itself, and basically learn how to sort of figure out where these formant transitions are pointing to, what frequencies they're pointing to. So when you go into a bilabial stop or come out of it, you can kind of think about this like lip rounding, make an analogy between closing your lips for a bilabial stop and rounding your lips for a high back vowel like ooh. When you round your lips for ooh, the formant frequencies go down, right? And when you make a bilabial stop, you close your lips, the formant frequencies will go down as well. And we see this more at the higher frequencies. There's just not a lot of room for this guy to change often, but F2 and F3 here are going down.
Bingo.
In the word bingo.
Bingo.
So this is a B. It's not voiced, but it's unaspirated, so we hear it as a B. You can transcribe it as an unaspirated P.
Bingo.
And the cues we get to that are that these guys are going down, F2 and F3. Okay, alveolars, and also for velars, the transition cues are more complicated. This is the easiest one, so I'm giving you that first. For alveolars, what happens is that for front vowels into an alveolar stop, we're going to look at the F2, how that changes, and that will tend to slope downward into the alveolar stop. And then we get the opposite pattern if we're looking from a back vowel into an alveolar stop. So F2 is going to slope upwards. So this is contextually based. So remember that F2 is a cue for front backness in vowels. So for front vowels, we have high F2. And then for back vowels, we have low F2. So that's kind of one of the reasons why F2 will go down into an alveolar from a front vowel, and it'll go up from a back vowel into an alveolar. Generally speaking, it wants to point to a frequency of about 1900 hertz or 1800 hertz, somewhere around there. So for this vowel,
heed,
where E is pretty high, maybe 21, or for F2 for E is pretty high, like 2100 or 2200 hertz, is going to point down a little bit as we go into that D.
heed,
We got this nice H here. Here's our E. Here's our voiced stop. Here's our D release burst. There's actually a few of them. But then this is the kind of crucial cue. So it's pretty subtle. You got to pay attention to the close specifics of it.
heed,
But we see the same kind of pattern if we go to different vowels. Again, it's pointing to about the same frequency for hid.
hid,
For head,
head,
about a straight line there. For had, it actually points up a little bit. So what's going on with had is that this is actually a bit of a diphthong. So had, from an ad to a schwa, and then by the time it gets to the schwa, it actually has to point that F2 up a little bit to get to the D. You can think about this with bilabials. We're closing our lips. With D, we're lifting the tip of our tongue up to the alveolar ridge. So you can kind of think about these transition cues as spectral signatures of the movement of the tip of the tongue to make that closure. Here's a few back vowels, and these are all going to be pointing up to about that same region.
hod, hood, hood,
You can see in hood,
hood,
it's kind of a diphthong as well. So it kind of gets up to this ear region before it gets to the closure. But it's the same spot, more or less, in every single one of these. It just depends on where you're coming from. So, yeah, I've given you the frequency a little bit lower here, but it's about 1700, 1800, it's below 2000 hertz. That's what the formant transitions are going to point to. That's known as the locus of the formant transition, where kind of in the stop the formant wants to point to, even though it might never actually get to that value because it's stopped by the closure of the vocal tract. So people got interested in trying to figure out how we identify stop, place of articulation when we invented when they invented the spectrogram way back in the 40s, or the spectrograph in the 40s. And it was pretty easy to figure out what vowels were doing, because you could see, like in the steady state of the vowel, that the formants were changing. But for stops, it was a lot more complicated, because it was more like an absence of cues rather than sort of a presence of cues. And they kind of hit on the idea that these transitions were really important to figuring out what stop, place of articulation you were hearing. So you can sort of get the stop, place of articulation information out of the signal, it turns out, without actually hearing the stop. So I've created some sample stimuli here. These are stop vowel stop words. I think the middle vowel is ah in every case. And I'm going to play them for you, but I cut out the stop. So I just kept the vowel and the transitions on either side of the midpoint of the vowel. So you're not hearing any stops at all, but maybe you can hear or perceive what the original stops were supposed to be here. I'll give you a listen.
dog, dog,
That's D-O-G.
gob, gob,
G-O-B, that's a lower frequency word, so you might not have picked up on it as quickly. And this one,
bod, bod,
it B-O-D, bod. So dog,
dog,
gob,
gob,
bod.
bod,
And again, there's no stops in those sound files, but maybe you're hearing them anyways because your mind knows how to put them back in based on the pattern of transition formant transitions that you hear in them. So the last and most complicated kind of transition pattern, but also the one with the clearest sort of cue in the spectrogram, are the ones we find for velars. So velars kind of depend. They don't have a reliable locus frequency for F2 because velar stops themselves will kind of change place of articulation depending on what vowel they're articulated next to. So for fronter vowels like E and A velar stop next to an E or A will be pronounced more like a palatal stop. You move your whole tongue forward. And for velar or backer vowels like oo or ah, something like that, you're going to produce a more backer or more velar place of articulation for a velar stop. So in this case, what you often will see is that for the palatal place of articulation, the locus, the frequency the vowels want to point to, in the stop itself will be higher, close to 2,000. For backer pronunciation of velar, you'll get a lower locus, like less than 1,500 maybe. But actually what you normally pick up on quite clearly in a velar stop is that F2 and F3 will come together, usually no matter where it is. And it's called the velar pinch, but it works in these fronter places of articulation, or these fronter articulations as well, next to front vowels. So this is really distinctive. We've seen it already in these Armenian samples. This is, again,
bug,
and
bug,
so F2 and F3 are coming together for this final velar stop.
bug,
And they're doing the same thing here for the voiceless one.
bug,
And there's kind of a double cue here because F2 and F3 come together here around 1900, 2000 hertz, and that's exactly where this more intense point of the velar release burst is located as well. So that gives you cues on both sides of the stop closure. This is a velar. And this is known famously as the velar pinch because you're pinching F2 and F3 together to get it. So this is me saying a variety of kind of nonsense words here.
A bab,
As a review,
a dad, a gag.
I guess dad is not a nonsense word. I shouldn't put myself down that way, but this is what we see. So I've got a little bit of voicing here. It doesn't always go all the way through the stop. For the ba, it'll show you
A bab,
that these formant frequencies tend to go down into that stop closure. F1, F2, F3, it's pretty consistent.
a bab,
For the alveolars,
a dad,
this one's pointing up here to about like 1700 hertz or so on both sides of the D. So F1 will tend to go down as well for the alveolar, so it's not a super great cue. F2 is a better thing to look at. And then for the last one,
a gag,
F2 and F3 come together. And that's a little harder to see here, maybe easier as you're going into it.
a gag,
And I've got more intensity in the release burst as well, right where those two come together. And I'm focusing really hard on saying this with a true ah here in the middle.
a gag,
I grew up actually always shifting this vowel to a, gag, something like that, a gag. Maybe you do that too as well, but like I said, when I went to school in California, my vowels got moved because people didn't like where they were. All right, you get transition cues for fricatives as well. They're not kind of as crucial to their perception because you get a lot of internal information about where a fricative is. This is the word shy.
shy,
But you can see it in the spectrogram as well. So this is sh is a little bit of a post-alveolar articulation. And you see this F2 pointing basically towards where you'd expect the locus frequency to be for an alveolar, like around 1700 hertz.
shy,
So I can eliminate the fricative part of this and just play the vowel that comes after it. You can tell me what you hear.
die, die, die,
And I don't know if you're like me, it's not quite as easy to pick up that stop place of articulation as it was for the previous samples I gave you. This is kind of like somewhere in between a duh and a guh,
die, die,
if you hear a stop at all. But it'll give you a little bit of information if you look closely. These are some samples of F versus theta. So for F, we'd expect F2 to go down, if anything. Theta is slightly backer, closer to an alveolar place of articulation. So F2 for a vowel like ah might point up going into the theta. But the fricatives themselves are going to look quite similar.
by, by,
And these are samples of just the vowel without the fricative at the beginning. If you're like me, you hear
by,
by, at least in the second one especially.
by,
And this one, we can play these without the fricative.
by, 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 by,
It's not quite as clear what you're hearing here. Maybe you hear a duh, die at the beginning, maybe you don't. We'll just play Bruce Hayes's.
by, by, by,
So it's not quite the same. These, again, are subtle cues to pick up on. F and theta are quite similar to each other. And I'll point out as well that it also depends a little bit on what variety of English you speak. So the story is that, sorry, for American theta, you typically get the tongue tip between the teeth or sort of on the underside of your upper row of teeth. And British pronunciations of theta will more often incur a tongue tip behind the upper teeth. I don't know which way you produce it. You can try it out yourself. Theta, I tend to say it as a true interdental like this, but that might be one reason why there's sounds like there's kind of a subtle Q difference between these two tokens here, between the American
thigh,
and British pronunciation.
thigh, thigh, thigh.
Yeah, so be that as it may, there is an interesting phonological phenomenon that we observe in English that, well, not only perceptually are labiodental and interdental fricatives the most confusable consonants in English, but there's some varieties of English which sort of replace the theta, at least in word final position or syllable final position, with a labial dental. Excuse me. So some examples like mouth going to mouth or with going to with, so on and so forth. Last time I gave this example, somebody pointed out to me that they pronounced the word with a voiced interdental at the tail end, and that really wouldn't work in this case, but it might in that case go to with as opposed to with. Sorry, with as opposed to with. I say it with. You can tell me which phonation type you pronounce this fricative with. But if you have it voiceless here in this version, it would probably be voiceless in the shifted one as well. So with or mouth, so on and so forth. A while back, so this tends to be not over prestigious dialects that do this. I used to in the old days have people transcribe different accents of English for this class, but yeah, that became too much work. But we used to have this token from Stephen Fry, who's this famous kind of upper crusty English actor. And it wasn't the best recording. I'll play it for you.
The truth is rarely pure and never simple.
That's a quote from Oscar Wilde, but you might notice he says the truth there.
The truth is rarely pure and never simple.
And a lot of people transcribe it as like the truth, which is not what he says, but some people might. Anyways, you might also get cues for this distinction. I think I mentioned this before visually. So I'll play a couple of examples here. I'll turn off the sound. We've done this before. It's always a little bit of fun. So here's consonant, vowel, consonant word produced by this speaker. Maybe you can figure out what it is. Do that one more time. And the answer is?
Rough.
Okay. Normally when I play this in class, some people are a little bit surprised because the first consonant there is an and a lot of people visually confuse it for a wa. That's an
Rough.
But those consonants are also confused, at least by those acquiring English. Little kids will often substitute was for ers, perhaps in part because ers are not super easy to say, but they also look very similar visually. When you see somebody say them, let's make sure the sound is off for the second one. Maybe you can tell me what's going on here. So this will be an American pronunciation without the Canadian raising, but it's the word
South.
Yeah, south.
South.
And there's maybe a little bit of a visual cue as she puts the tip of her tongue underneath her teeth there. With the final F here, didn't really look at it that much.
Rough.
You can pretty clearly see her curling her lower lip back to make contact with the teeth. So there is some visual information that could distinguish those two, whether or not you actually use it. That's all I'm going to say about stop acoustics for now and fricative acoustics for time being. Next time we'll talk about glide acoustics and how they relate to secondary articulation. So I'll see you then.